Alrighty, so we have another Zoom style workshop, and we're not even going to do the typical presentation format for this. It is very late. I'm still in my PJs, a different set of PJs this time. Nighttime is like the best time for me to record these videos. And what I really want us to focus on today is how you can move through reviewing your edTPA or by extension CalTPA, but especially the edTPA, and making sure it isn't terrible, right? Now, if you've watched our other videos, then your edTPA will not be a mess. I know that sounds very, very harsh, but occasionally I do see it where someone might be very confused. They're not sure what to do and how to do it. And then by the time they think they're ready to submit, they have everything in front of them, and it is absolutely either not where it needs to be, or there's a lot of pieces and parts that are out of order. And the last thing I would want would be for any of you to get condition codes. Now, hopefully you've seen or at least watched to a good degree the other two, maybe even three videos. I know the super class was two parts, and then there's the lesson plan video as well. If you haven't, you probably should go watch that, or like cut through some of the episodes, or the parts, I should say, in general. But either way, you really want to make sure that you've had a strong understanding of what the requirements are for your specific edTPA. Because this video here, we're not necessarily going to talk about the requirements, but when you get to the final stage of your portfolio, making sure that it looks great. Of course, as well, in the super class, we basically go over that. If you're following it step by step, you're already set. But this is for those of you that didn't decide to do that, right? Or you just like the extra reinforcement. So, a big concern that a lot of you have are condition codes. I'll say this. If you follow everything the way you need to and you don't make any like weird mistakes, you're probably not going to get a condition code. If you look at your rubric, and not even just your rubric, but your handbook closely regarding what it says you need and how the documents are supposed to be set up, you will not get a condition code. For example, if it's telling you that you need to provide student work samples and they need to be provided in a certain way, you have to provide it in a certain way. Like we discussed in the super class, if you have early childhood, for example, and you're you're giving your students feedback, written feedback wouldn't work because your students are 4 years old, right? So keep things like that in mind. If you're doing physical education, it will say and tell you in your handbook, you need to have video support to reference how your students did during the assessments. Why? Because it's physical education. So keep things like that in mind. First and foremost, make sure that you have met the requirements that you need to, just the basic ones. Those are in your handbook. And again, if you go back to the super class video, part one, there is a section within the video. It has clearly defined chapters where it should, that shows you exactly what the artifacts page looks like. So if you're worried about condition codes, just make sure you follow everything that your handbook stated. Put your documents in the right order, put it in the right sections, and make sure you have what they're asking you to have. That's pretty much going to prevent you from getting a condition code. One other thing that I mentioned in the super class that I'll mention again here is making sure that you don't make any weird last minute changes before you submit, because then you are a lot more likely to do something that'll give you a condition code. I've seen it. I remember one day, this was a couple years ago, where I worked with the client step by step. I was like, cool, you're ready to submit. This was before I was submitting with people. After this, I was kind of like, if you're working with me step by step, you can submit with me for free. I'd rather just literally watch you do it. Right. But at this point in time, I wasn't really doing that unless people asked. So she was like, all right, cool. You're going to submit. I was like, cool, going to submit. 3 weeks later, she said she got a condition code and she didn't pass. I was like, oh my gosh, what happened? I feel so bad. I'm so sorry. I quickly took my apology back when I had her send me the work that she did. And she showed me that at the very last minute, she got something, so she got some idea in her mind that she needed to change everything. And she started changing around key documents. For what reason? I don't know. I will say if you are working with someone like myself or my team, and we're working through this step by step, you literally have no reason to ever do that because, again, we're helping you step by step. But even if you're just working alone, you have to trust yourself enough to know that what you're doing is okay. Even if it's not okay, I would rather you still stick with what you have than risk giving yourself a silly condition code because in the middle of the night, the day before you decided to submit, you felt like tweaking things and then you put things in the wrong order. So, what I'm now going to do is share my screen and we're going to look at a sample completed edTPA portfolio. Now, this is the same portfolio that I've used in the other superclass videos and workshops. I have plenty. I have plenty of samples from early childhood, elementary, performing arts, mathematics, biology, etc. I'm doing this for continuity just so you can see what a finished portfolio looks like and how to review it. It's the same each way, but there's a method to the madness. There's a reason why we kind of keep looking at the same samples. So if you're like, well, I want to look at a different sample, we can get to that another time. Again, just trust that there's a reason that I'm choosing this specific portfolio to help us better understand the concepts that we need to. So give me a moment. If it isn't blatantly obvious, I record this like fully in real time and I just go through and don't edit it. So here we are. So ideally, you should have your edTPA documents finished, and then you can put them into folders, something that says like final documents, right? So you can differentiate between drafts and what's final. So let's go through. And again, we're not going to look at per se like question by question in terms of here's what you need to do, more so for you to see, is this complete, is this not? So starting with your context for learning. Are all of the questions filled out? Does it make sense? You don't have to go super in depth with this, but if there's anything in particular that your scorers would need to know about your classroom, this is where you want to mention it, right? This is not where you put that you had Spirit Day when you were recording and you guys are all wearing clown suits. No one cares about that. You don't need to put that in there. One thing that you should really check for before you submit is to make sure that this area here, question 3, matches your commentaries. So every type of student that you mentioned here, right, should be mentioned again thoroughly, really, throughout your commentaries. If you mentioned a specific designation of student here, but you didn't mention it at all in your commentaries, take that student out of here. If you're like, well, wait, Nia, but the student's really, take it out. Take it out. Again, you guys know I'm a very no fluff type of person. Take it out and move on, right? Pearson only knows what you show them and what you tell them. So if you realize that you said you had a student with a speech language impediment and you threw that student here, or maybe the student had a 504, so you put the student up here, and you did not mention that student once in any of your written work and any of your commentaries, take that student out. So that is one thing that you really want to check for before you submit. If you are in California, this is very important for you all. Look at this bottom piece. Double check that you've met this requirement. It states that if you don't have any English language learners, select a student who is challenged by academic English. If you don't have a student with an identified disability or a student who's from an underserved education group, select a student receiving tiered support within the classroom or a student who often struggles with content. Odds are you will have at least one student that fits in one of these categories. If for some reason you say you don't, say you do and figure it out. And then make sure to go back into your commentary and tweak those details to make sure that it lines up. Do what you need to do. But this is very important for California candidates. Other than that, make sure that you've either met the page limit or you just haven't exceeded it. Also, this is a common question. Do you need to fill up the page limit? No, you don't. Just don't go over it. And of course, make sure that everything in these templates are placed within brackets when they give you brackets. Your lesson plans. Make sure that all of your lesson plans are in one document, right? So you can see lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. If you Lesson plans I see are very common for people to, how do we put this? Have a to mix up their drafts and their final documents. I'm not really sure why. I think it's because there's a lot of tweaking that goes on. So just make sure that your final documents are what you're going to submit. Um, your lesson plans, again, don't have to be perfect. They do just need to make sense, right? So that's as much as I can say about that when it comes to reviewing your lesson plans. You really shouldn't need to tweak much by the time that you're done with them. Make sure that your major categories make sense. Make sure that this is something that if like a substitute teacher were to read it, they would understand how to teach your class, right? If you said that you're teaching specific stories, make sure the stories are listed. If you said that you're doing specific activities that are major, make sure the activities are described, right? Make sure that your standards are the same 1 to 2 standards per lesson. And make sure that you've met the page limit. For the edTPA, you can do a max of 4 pages per lesson plan. So please make sure that it's not even slightly over. Please make sure that it doesn't spill over on the top with an empty box. Figure it out. Do not get a condition code because you have like a blank page that puts this over the limit. Other than that, that is how you're going to review your lesson plans. Every section should be clear. It should be organized. It doesn't need to go super into detail, but it needs to be understandable. It really could be half the length of this, and that's fine, as long as it's clear. And like I said in the super class, and if you're super confused, again, hop off this video and go to the super class because I'm not going to explain all of the what is this and what is this and what is this. I'm not doing that here. But I will say one more time. If you are looking at this and you're like, oh my gosh, my lessons don't look like this. Like I said in the super class, you can do any template you want. Some people are given templates from their university and they decide to utilize that, but you can take out sections as you need. These aren't even scored. Only your commentaries are scored. If you are confused, again, go back to the super class. Now, part C are your instructional materials. This is all about what materials your students would need to do the lesson. What are you doing to teach the lesson? This is not necessarily your assessments, but there can be overlap. Anchor charts, sentence stems, group worksheets and things like that. This would all go in here. There's a max of 5, it's not 4, I believe it's 5 pages per lesson here. So make sure, again, you're not going over. And yeah, you're just going by lesson. Make sure that the lessons are clearly labeled. Make sure that you can read these images. I don't know why. I see it all the time. People put pictures of their instructional materials into this document and they make it like, you guys see this little wood like plank here, like how it starts here, if you can see my cursor, hopefully, and then it goes to like where this A is, and then it goes up. There, some of you I've seen take these images and you size it down to be that size. I don't know why. That makes no sense. If you can't read it, then I can't read it, then your scores can't read it, and if they can't read it, they're gonna go, condition code. It makes no sense. Why even add the picture in? You can't read it. And if you're like, well, there's too much, I have too many pictures and doesn't matter. Figure out how to format it so that people can actually see what the image says. You don't need every major image. These are the most relevant documents, right? So you want to take a picture of a storybook that you're using, fine. You don't need to take a picture of every page, just take a picture of the cover, right? These are the most relevant things. If you have a YouTube video, you can't link to videos in your anywhere in your edTPA. You can't do any links. They won't open them. They can't open them. So just take a screenshot of the main page of the YouTube video or things like that. Yes, of course, you can use teacher pay teacher resources. That's fine. You don't even need to cite in your portfolios. Similarly, we have your assessment materials. It's really the same thing. This is what your students are doing independently or semi-independently, right? It's again, it's okay if there's some overlap. Just make sure you have this in here clearly. You don't even need to explain what they're there for. That's what your commentary is here for. There's no maximum page limit for this, but do make sure you have it. And lastly is your commentary. Now, again, we're just reviewing to make sure it makes sense. If you want to know what each question has and more of the details, head to the super class. That was like over 3 hours worth, and I was very tired when I did that. So that's what that's there for. When you review this, make sure, of course, that all of your responses are in the brackets. Back in, I remember it was like 2014, and I had a professor, I think that edTPA just kind of rolled out around then. And I had a professor stress that at that time, they were very strict on the brackets, right? So you want to make sure your responses are in the brackets. Nowadays, they're not as strict as they were when this first rolled out, but better safe than sorry. Make sure your responses are in the brackets. If you want to bold keywords, you can, but please don't bold everything. Don't bold things just to bold them as if you're. I've seen people bold things, and I'm going to say this very crassly, I'm sorry. And the way that they bold is almost as if they're thinking that their scorer is an idiot. Your scorer can read. You don't need to bold every other word. I say this because I've seen it, and I'm like, hey, do you realize that 70% of this is bold? Bolding things doesn't mean that your score is going to go, oh, yeah, perfect, more points, right? Bolding just lets your scorer know that you have, or it reminds your scorer that you've acknowledged key concepts, but it's still up to you to explain these key concepts well, right? You're not going to get over on anyone by doing that, by bolding. So make sure that you've bolded the things that you need to. If you want, you don't have to. When I did mine many, many moons ago, I didn't. But if you do decide to bold, let the bolding be as far as you go. Don't highlight anything, or please don't change the font. So make sure with your templates that Pearson provides as well, that you keep the Arial 11-point font. Your other documents, it doesn't matter. For the templates that they give you, you do have to stick to what they tell you, right? Every bullet point that they give you, make sure that you've addressed it and you've explained it clearly. I know this sounds very straightforward. Oh, I just realized that this is not connected to my charger. That would be so crazy, right? If it's just like blacked out in the middle. I'm glad I realized that. So it can be so common when you're working to get so into the details that you can very easily skip one of these key points. You think you've talked about the related skills, and then you realize like you've only acknowledged it in your head. So as annoying as it might seem, go through and read through this step by step and see where you've mentioned each of these bullet points, or if you have. Another tip you can do is use Command, I think it's Command F if you have a MacBook, and it's a similar key code, I guess we can say. If you're doing, if you have a PC or a Chromebook, use that to search these terms. So if you're like, did I mention the essential literacy strategy? Use that, type in the word essential literacy strategy, and let it show you where you've mentioned it. Now, of course, just mentioning it isn't enough. You have to actually make sure that you've discussed it and explained it. So double check. Did you bring up how this related to the question? And did you explain it thoroughly? Not just what's, but a lot of why. Do that for each of these. As we continue, when it talks about how your lesson plans build on each other, make sure that you've actually discussed how your lesson plans build on each other. A lot of these sound so simple, but I see it all the time. We're working very, very hard, and it can be very easy to forget a major portion of a question. And you've looked at this so many times, you think you've gotten it, or you think you've done it, and you haven't. Right? It happens to the best of us. I triple check myself. Even when I work with clients, we triple check each other just to make sure that we've checked off everything we need to, right? You can even make a checklist if you want. Make sure as you're reading this that you again have explained, not just stating the what, explaining the why, explaining the how, explaining how things have connected with one another. In question 2, make sure that you've discussed your students and their background, and not the lesson plan, not the lesson plans in the learning segment per se. This is all background knowledge. And in question 3, when you do your review for this, I want you to make sure that you go so annoyingly in depth that you almost get irritated reviewing this question. right? You want to make sure that you've connected this back to everything that you mentioned in question two. You've talked about theory and you have really discussed. But anything that seems like it could have been potentially baseline, I want you to go above and beyond with it. For those of you that struggle with making connections, again, use those higher order thinking skills, and you can, as a resource, not as an end all be all, but as a resource, copy and paste what you've written into ChatGPT or a similar form of AI and ask it, what are specific ways I can use to, um, what are specific, what are, how would we say this? Like gaps that you see in terms of how I could elaborate deeper. Don't necessarily have it write the response for you because, like I discussed in the super class, ChatGPT needs a lot of information to be able to even slightly make a edTPA response. But you can ask it, hey, this is what I needed to answer. This is what I put. Do you see any gaps? Do you see anywhere where I kind of just said what, but I didn't say why? You can do that, and that'll make a lot of sense for you. Make sure you've listed your supports and your strategies very, very clearly. And make sure that you only had one language function. Um, if you had a language function, you only have one, and all be all. There's no interpretation for that. When you talk about language demands, make sure that you've very clearly discussed what your students need to do in terms of utilizing language to best understand the questions, and then how you will support that, like what you tangibly could do or provide the students to help them out with that. It's very common for people in this question to kind of dance around it, so be very specific. And of course, when you get to question 5, which is all about your assessments, make sure you've discussed your formal and informal assessments for each lesson. Lastly, this is the longest commentary. It can be very easy to go over the page limit. Make sure you are at your page limit and not over. Whether it's 9 pages for the elementary candidates, I think special ed, I think you guys have 12. It's either 10 or 12, something crazy like that. It was just doing a task review for special ed client. And every single time I do it, I never get used to how many pages you guys have. You don't need citations. They don't do you any good or anything like that. You're not required to have them. So that's about it for task 1, right? That, if anything, is going to be your most difficult task. So when you review it, go through and really make sure it makes sense. Task 2, when you look through your videos, now I can't play the videos, right? Sorry about that. But when you look through your videos, make sure they play. Make sure they play very clearly. Make sure you use the right clips. I know that when you have all of these clips and documents, it can be very easy to get things mixed up. So make sure what you said is video 1 is actually like the video 1 that you have in your folder. I see that very, very often where we're uploading and then it's like, wait, where's video 1? I thought video 1 was here. Make sure what you said was video 2 is actually video 2 if you have a video 2. Make sure that the amount of time that video 1 is supposed to be for you is the amount of time it's supposed to be. Again, because the drafts and the final versions can very much get mixed up. Even if you're like, no, Nia, I know it's perfect, double check anyway. This is not where you want to just double check. Take the extra couple minutes, right? Make sure your videos can very easily be heard. Make sure that you can be seen, and make sure that the minimum amount required of your students can be seen. Typically for you guys, it'll be maybe 4 students minimum, etc. Make sure that the kids can be seen so that your scorers know that they exist and you're not just speaking to like AI students or something. Anything else to review with your videos? That should be about it. You don't have to stress about like if your outfit was perfect or things like that. That's totally fine. Just make sure you have that covered and make sure, of course, you are not even a second over that time limit, right? Not even a second. Okay, now, and also the size of your videos. Make sure that the size your videos are compressed. You can use Handbrake and make sure that the size matches what you need it to match. Typically, it's between 200 and 300 megabytes. So make sure that you have that. When you get to your commentary, double check to make sure that you don't mix up the videos. This is common. People will say video 1 is from lesson 2 and it was actually from lesson 3, or that video 2 is from. Make sure that that's clear. Make sure that you've discussed as much as you could each video. There, are questions, especially when you get to question like maybe 4, where you might find that one video applies much more with much more depth than another video, and that's fine. But for question, like for this, question 2A, there's no excuse. Each video needs to be mentioned. Make sure that it's mentioned and it's mentioned clearly, and again, make sure your timestamps aren't mixed up, because that can very much happen where easily you say from 152 to 250 to 215, and you think that's from video 1, but it was actually timestamped from video 2. So make sure that that aligns. This is why I mentioned my very special tip for keeping note of all of your timestamps, so then that way you don't have to actually go through the videos to see where they matched, right? Make sure that you follow the formula that we mentioned as well, and make sure that you are being very in-depth with your responses. Just because this is about a video and this is your shortest commentary doesn't mean that your responses should be weak and basic and boring. Continuing, keep that same continuity and make sure that, how do I put this? You want to make sure here that you're not getting lazy, or that you didn't get lazy. This is a very common one between question 3 and 4 for some reason when it comes to task 2, where people just kind of tap out. Lock back in and make sure that you did not skimp on this question. I see it all the time where question 2 is like very meaty, question 5 is kind of meaty, question 3 and 4 are starving. So buff those up. If you have space in your page limit, go back in. This is one where I would recommend that you have the time and energy to do so. Go back in. Don't necessarily add timestamps because it's not quantity, but it's quality. So spruce up what you already have. More explanations, how it connects to your learning objectives, critical thinking, etc. Right? Continue to do the same for the rest of this. Make sure everything's in your brackets. Make sure that you do not give a weak response for question 4. This one can tend to stress a lot of people out. So definitely double check to make sure that makes sense. Go back to the super class if you need a bit more insight on that. You do not want short responses for this. Even if you tend to find that your response focuses more on one video than the other, you still need to very clearly discuss what it's asking you to discuss and thoroughly explain your justification for how this connects to the question. Right? Remember, we don't want a lot of what's, we want a lot of why. And then, of course, question 5, like we said in the other video, go crazy with it. This is where you're showing that you know how to meet students' needs. You know how to, if you struggle during an area in teaching, you know how to acknowledge that. So please make sure you're not in your feelings about what you taught, and you were very clear in and changes you could have made. So that's about it for task 2, right? It's only 2 documents, very straightforward, but you need to go in depth. When I do task reviews, right? Sometimes I'll have some of you go, and I get it, but I'm like, some of you might be like, well, how come task 2 is the same sort of like price or length or whatever as the other task? Well, because task 2 only has 2 parts, but the 2 parts are detailed. You have to go through videos and annotate them second by second, right? If you don't have that, or if you're doing this on your own, right? Think of it this way. And task 2 was almost too breezy and there's not a lot of detail, that kind of shows you didn't put that effort in. So when you understand how detailed task 2 is, you're able to understand why it would require so much time or as much effort as the other tasks. Now we get to task 3. This is all about assessing how your students did. So in terms of reviewing this, right, let's start with A, which would be the work samples. You want your student work samples to be separated. Show you an example. Do not have your student names on it. If you had a rubric, you can put the rubric score in there. You don't have to identify what type of student you had, like struggling reader, etc. here, but you can. And make sure again that the student work is clear. Make sure that these pictures are big enough to be seen, right? I know some of the things that I'm mentioning can seem very uh just very annoying. Honestly, I get it. I'm saying all of the common misconceptions I've seen over the past 7-ish years because I know what it's like to be in your shoes, but I also know what it's like to see so many examples of people coming in super stressed, and there's tiny little weird mistakes that you might do because you're tired and you're exhausted and you're doing this. So make sure that your work samples are in your separate documents, right? And everything is clear. Make sure that the work samples that you chose for each focus students actually match, right? Sometimes I see people change focus students last minute and they forget to like update their folder. So make sure that's very clear. And again, make sure, I say again because I recorded the super class earlier today. You guys might not have been there for that. And again, though, make sure that whatever your work samples are is consistent. This can't be like different work samples you can't have different work samples. They all have to be from the same worksheet, I should say. Focus student 1, 2, and 3, same worksheet. This is not, just keep them consistent. Um, next is your Next is your feedback. This person did audio feedback. If you did audio feedback, make sure it plays, right? Make sure it's clear and make sure it's under the time limit. I think it's 2 minutes and 20 seconds per student max. Typically, most people don't even get that far, but make sure it is clear and make sure it's feedback that you're giving to the student. The student doesn't have to be there for that, but it should make sense. Like it should sound like you're giving to the student if you're doing audio. If you wrote it, make sure that it looks like you're writing it to the student, right? Um, Next, in terms of review, your evaluation criteria. Your evaluation criteria should be clear and it should be detailed. You do not only just want to put an answer key for this. For math, if you have task 4, you can do that. Not for literacy. Make sure it's clear. If you need more support, go use a rubric maker to help you. But it should be clear, right, and detailed. Again, if this looks overwhelming, take your work sample and put it into ChatGPT or something similar and say, hey, based on this specific criteria, if you're doing comprehension, you can't have a rubric that says like, oh, grammar and spelling, right? Based on this criteria, what do you recommend I break this down into for my rubric, right? Or evaluation criteria. Make sure it's clear. And again, make sure it matches the actual worksheet and assessment. Go through each section to make sure it matches your learning objectives and your central focus. If you see something that doesn't match your central focus or your learning objectives, even if it seems to match the assessment, change it, right? Because you'll really get hit for points with that. And lastly is your commentary. All right, so we're moving through this in pretty good time. You, of course, want to make sure that you don't go over the page limit, right? You see this really pretty section up here that's in the tiny, annoying fine print. Make sure you adhere to that. If you had a transcription of anything, you can add it here, right? Like it says, and it doesn't count towards your page total, but make sure that you're using that mindfully and sensibly. And typically most people don't use that. So the biggest thing I want you to think about when you're reviewing this is making sure that everything is consistent. It is very easy to do this type of work and you're doing it late at night and you're tired, you're stressed, and you've written like 6 paragraphs on something. And then when you read it back, the 6 paragraphs like literally don't make sense. And you just went on like an entire beautiful, beautiful tangent that is not necessary or aligned in any way possible. So double check that. Like once you have a good, clear mind, actually read through what you wrote and go, okay, like yes, I wrote a lot of words, but does this in any way make sense? This is a big one that I see for task 3 and a big one that I see for task 1. Task 2 tends to not have that issue. So be very Make sure that everything is aligned and consistent. If you meant you had objectives, make sure the objectives are clear. And again, they're consistent with what you had in the work sample. They're consistent with what you talk about um, down here in your review of student learning, right? Okay, continuing. If a question asks you, and I know some of you have different setups, to talk about the three focus students and the whole class, you're going to talk about the three focus students and the whole class. If it splits it up and says only the whole class, you're only going to talk about the whole class, right? Make sure you adhere to what it told you. Again, I know it sounds annoying and silly. This is the biggest way I see people lose points or even possibly get condition codes. You're typing, you're typing, you're typing, you have a lot of stuff, and before you know it, you wrote a lot of things, but you missed an entirely important section. So make sure everything that you were asked for this specific question, you mention it in this question, right? And mentioning something in another question doesn't matter. If you needed to have mentioned it in a specific question, it has to be mentioned there too. And make sure, of course, you went into detail and you had a lot of critical thinking. Again, a lot of the explanations, a lot of the here's why I think so. Here's not just what I noticed, but the justification, how I think it connected to what I know about the students and their learning styles and the learning objectives, their usage of the related skills, etc. Make sure, of course, that in these more basic questions where it's asking you, how did you get the feedback? How did you upload the files, that you're clear with what you used? And then, of course, as you discuss the focus students' feedback, etc., that you are very detailed, not in saying what the feedback was, but why you gave it, right? Really, a lot of this is just whys, a lot of whys, a lot of justifications. If you can make sure that you have that, that is going to ensure that you have a portfolio that's like really cool and not terrible, because we don't want to be down here. We want you to be up here. And if you find yourself feeling exhausted, but the submission date is coming up and you're looking at this like, honestly, there's a lot of ways I could have expanded. I would rather you wait to submit and give yourself time to expand on your thoughts than force yourself to submit and submit like a really weak portfolio. Like, why would you do that? You know what I'm saying? Or you can always get a task review from me or my lovely coaches who are former edTPA scorers, and we'll help you out with that because we go line by line. Especially me, I am very analytical and neurotic, and I literally go line by line, and I'm like, okay, change this, add this, change this, add this. It takes away all of the need to think about anything. By the time I'm done with the task review, you know exactly what to change without having to think about what to add or take away. So that's an option too, right? If you want that support. But that is there. So yeah, be very clear and honest with yourself. Is the work that you did strong enough to submit? Or is there just a lot of basic like what's in lists of things? If there's a lot of lists, ditch it, redo it, not redo it, but like add to it, strengthen it, take the extra time. It's worth potentially moving yourself into the next submission window just to get that done. Whatever evidence you decide to use, make sure that you use it clearly and you referenced it clearly. If you added additional files or referenced other files, make sure that you reference them in a straightforward manner and that you're not confusing the two. Because sometimes I can see people mention their task 2 video clips and also an extra file, but they mix up how they're describing it. So make sure that is aligned, right? Don't take anything for granted. Basically, it's kind of like I'm saying, not like don't trust yourself, but understand that you were doing something very intense under very high stakes, and you need to review this very carefully. It's kind of like, this is basically like the bar, the way that law students, lawyers have the bar. This is basically your bar exam, right? It's intense. A lot of people have to repeat it multiple times if they don't have the support and understanding. You want to be really, really intense. The only difference is that the bar exam, you have to take it like in person, one shot through. And this, you have to, it's like an open book test and it's still intense. So you do not want to skimp out on reading this and rereading this and vetting it. If your school has like, say you can't get a task review from me or you don't want it, or you're not a member of the Glow Lounge where you can get you can do like a 15-minute video chat and have 10, what is it, 10 email correspondences with me just for something like 50 or 60 bucks a month. Great if you can't afford a full task review. If that's not an option for you as well, also go to your school's writing center, right? And you can get them to not like, oh, help me with my edTPA, but like review your writing. And you can ask them, did I give a lot of explanation or do you notice a lot of just basic thoughts thrown in without justification? So you can have that too and utilize, if you have a university, your school's writing center and support. Because the thing is, even if they don't understand the context of the edTPA, they could tell you a basic sentence is a basic sentence, whether you understand the context or not, right? Make sure that you have that. And then with this last question, make sure that you've clearly differentiated between the what and the why. The what is for question 4A, the why and the justification is for question 4B, and that you've gone very into depth into what strategies you would use for your whole class and your 3 focused students. If you felt like this was weak, if you felt like it was short, if you felt like you got lazy, add to it, 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 add to it. Mention maybe more theory, mention specific stories you can use, extra strategies, but do not skimp on that. Right. Okay. Now, this is loading. Lastly, for task 4, if you have it, if you don't, you can hang out, you can skip ahead. For task 4, right? Your context for learning is the same as the other one. Make sure, actually, though, as you go through this, if you have a task 4, that you didn't accidentally copy the wrong task 4 template. Like if your task 1 context for learning was literacy, make sure your task 4 context for learning is the math one. If your task 1 context for learning was math, make sure your task 4 context for learning is literacy. Sometimes I've seen people accidentally like copy the same template twice and they'll like use the literacy template twice or the math template twice. Or like they've done the literacy and math template, but they don't actually upload the right one. So make sure that you have the right one in the right spot. Make sure as well, and this goes, actually, I could have said this earlier too. Make sure, of course, we've only discussed like 1 class period, right? Not your 5 class periods, just 1. And again, any students that you mentioned here would have to be mentioned in the commentary. So if you mentioned students that weren't mentioned in your commentary, take them out. And if you're in California, make sure that you met these specific requirements, right? And again, do or say what you need to do or say to get this done. Interpret that as you will. I'm a big advocate for meaning of requirement however you can. In part B, to review this, make sure, of course, you're not going over the page limit. Make sure that you don't have a lot of standards for this. I mean, this is constant throughout your whole portfolio, but make sure everything that you have makes sense and connects. And a common thing I've seen is sometimes the central focus not matching what the lessons are about. So make sure it matches. I know that sounds silly, but especially if you did your task 4 last, it can be very easy to get burnt out and to start like just throwing things in this document. Again, this document isn't graded, but everything that you mentioned here connects with your commentary. So you want to be very clear with it. Right. That's only 2 pages, so make sure you don't go over the page limit. Make sure your part C is your formative assessment. This is a blank copy of the whole class assessment. This is called your common assessment. It has to be blank. Make sure you pick the right one. Make sure you don't mess this up or else you will get a condition code. Make sure you have the right thing put here. This is what the whole class did, but it's blank. Now the next one is your evaluation criteria. Again, make sure that it connects with what you need it to connect with. This could be this could be an answer key, but make sure it is there and make sure it is focused on the common assessment only, right? Make sure that these should be aligned. Um, After this is E. These are your, and you're going to keep this in three separate documents. We kept this in one, and then before we submitted this together, we split it. Your three focus students are going to be in separate documents, kind of like with task three, right? Make sure that this is for your common assessment, that whole class assessment. It's not your re-engagement here. I've seen people get condition codes, and it's so unfortunate because they accidentally put the wrong assessment here. Make sure that it's the right one, and make sure when you're uploading, it's the right one. All right. A, B, C, D, E, F. F is the only place where you start to get to the re-engagement. You don't need to have an answer key, but you do need to have each focus student on a separate page. Again, we had to split this up. And make sure everything is labeled as well. We label this just using the iPhone. So like you can Google Doc, add the image in even on your phone, and then click or have the image go into like the editing piece on built into your phone. We typed in like focus student re-engagement 2, or you can just add this into the Google Doc itself and upload, right? But again, make sure this is the re-engagement, not the whole class assessment. Lastly, to review your, where is that? A, B, C, D, E, F, G. To review your commentary. This one is a long, for elementary at least, if you have it, a long commentary, but it's not like the hardest one. You want to make sure that that your charts are clear, easily understood. Make sure that no pieces and parts are out of order. Make sure that it is within the bracket. Again, I know if you're like, really, don't shoot the messenger here. I'm just making sure you pass and that you don't get some weird condition code, because I would like literally crash out if I got a condition code or something over this little bracket. Make sure it's clear. If a lot of people tend to do drafts for this, so make sure that you have the final version in here. If you use Excel or any spreadsheets to make your charts, make sure that the updated version is here, and that by the time you turn this into a PDF, that the finalized version is set, right? Nothing shifted, nothing moved. If you had anything listed points, numbers, make sure they add up, right? It can be very easy. I've done it, human error, to add the numbers up, and it's like, oh, this is actually a number off. I'm not saying it'll lose you points, but you just want to be consistent, so double check that. This question here, is this 1 or 2? I believe this is 1C, right? Right. Question 1C, if there's any question I want you to go over a ton, it is this one. Make sure that you discuss each bullet point in detail. We discussed this more in the super class, of course, but do not skimp on this question. If this question even slightly looks short or tiny, you need to go back and do it. This is a question that will absolutely tank your score for the rest of your portfolio if it's not strong. And this question also builds into, this question is only about, or not only, this question is about the whole class, and you're going to use that same sort of formula and understanding from when you talk about the 3 focus students in question 2B. So make sure you're very clear on the concepts that needed to be learned in the common assessment, and this is only the common assessment, on the procedures. If you think you like really struggle with that, and I do recommend like working on understanding like what concepts need to be learned, procedures, etc. Just as a teacher, right? That's something that, and I'm not shaming you, but that's something that your professor should have taught you and your mentors, which is math concepts, math procedures, and key skills. And then that way, when you're looking at worksheets and math lessons, you know exactly, okay, here's what the students are doing, here's what they're learning, here's why they're learning it. A lot of people tend to struggle with math task 4 because of this. Because they don't actually know how to break down. It's not that it's not that teaching the math concept is hard, or that the math concept is hard in and of itself. It's that they haven't been taught how to look at that. So if you struggle with that, or you're in a time crunch and you don't have like a mentor to go to, what you can do is take that whole class assessment, the picture of it, put it into ChatGPT and say, based on this, like, what are the key concepts, key and basic concepts that a student would need to know to be able to complete this worksheet successfully. What are the key procedures that a student would need to know and do to complete this worksheet successfully, etc. Keep in mind that is best used, I would say, for the concepts. It might mess up the procedures, right? It might need it might need you to give it more context. And if you already did a solid job with this, I do not recommend using the ChatGPT method because more likely than not, you're going to add something in that doesn't belong in. But if you are like struggling and you're like, I don't know, add that in. Use that as support, or go to your fellow math teacher and say like, hey, please help me out. But you want those questions to be strong. Make sure your objectives match. Make sure that you responded to every bullet point. Again, don't skip over this. Make sure you responded clearly to every bullet point and you stated why everything in each bullet point needed to be done and why it was necessary. And then, of course, make sure that you discuss your re-engagement in detail and the strategies that you use. Do not skimp, do not skimp, do not skimp. So that's kind of your way to review your edTPA. Should we stop sharing? I think we should stop sharing, right? Okay. So that's your way to just kind of review your edTPA to make sure it's not terrible and make sure it does what it needs to do, right? Again, you want to make sure that you've clearly understood all of the prompts, all of the questions. And another thing I want to add is make sure as well that you met what the rubrics are asking. That's actually a really big one. What you could do is as you go through and you're reviewing, you can keep your rubrics side by side and see, okay, like did I hit what I needed to hit for level 5, not level 3, level 4 and 5. Again, ideally level 5, because if you try to aim for a 5, you'll probably get a 3, and that's fine because then you'll still pass, right? If you aim for a 3, you're probably going to get a 1 on that rubric. So make sure that everything is aligned, make sure it's detailed. Make sure that, again, all of your artifacts, which are the different documents, match what they need to match, and you match that page in the handbook that says exactly what you need to do and how you needed to have done it. Make sure again that the brackets are in the right spot, that everything is readable, that everything can be open, that everything can be accessed, that your videos and audios play, that you can hear them, that they make sense. If you have any confusion on anything, don't submit. Now, if you're a little nervous, that's fine. But if you're actually still confused and you're you just really don't know, I would recommend taking the time to do your work longer instead of just forcing yourself to submit. Also, if you are submitting to a third-party platform, sorry, I'm just like looking at the Zoom. I'm like, this is so ridiculous. Some people, like when they're doing these recordings, they have like a whole setup and everything. And I do have it. But the only way for me to get through something as tedious as the edTPA regarding recording YouTube videos is for me to do it in as relaxed of a setting. So it just caught me off guard how funny this is. But yeah, if you're submitting to a third party, first, Sidmay, Anthology, Chalk and Wire. I don't think WGU requires the TPA anymore, but there's that. There's another one, I forget. Maybe like Blackboard or Canva, I think. Make sure that everything is put in the right spots on there, and make sure that you have enough time to transfer everything over, and that when it transfers over, it works, right? It can be very easy to mess something up there and not realize it when you transfer it over to Pearson. So definitely do be careful with that. Give yourself enough time to submit, and you're always more than welcome to have someone read it over again. Like, even if they don't know the context of the edTPA, ask them, does this make sense? Because the thing is that the edTPA is very context specific and it has a lot of jargon, but that's also why you have to explain things so clearly, and you can't write as if your scorers know everything, right? And as if they will just assume what you're thinking. The edTPA is not based on assumptions at all. So you have to write it as if the person reading it has never taught or understood any of that stuff, which is why you have to go into such detail. And of course, your scores have taught, your scores are teachers, but that's the way you have to write it and create it. That's why you're always tying things back together, you're being repetitive, you're constantly mentioning your learning objectives like all the time. And you're constantly going into detail. And before you submit, just make sure you do feel really proud of yourself. Even if you don't, you should. This is a lot of work. It's a lot of work, no matter whether I help you or not, whether you use any other kind of resources, whatever it is. I tell everyone celebrate as soon as you submit. Even if you don't like, celebrate as soon as you submit. Treat yourself to a cupcake, a spa day, go on Groupon and find something fun. You live in a major city, I promise you there are fun free events that are going on. Treat yourself for taking a step towards getting your license, your certification, your credential. That does take a lot of work. And when you pass, please, because I love to celebrate it on Instagram, on Facebook, etc. Please shoot me a message, an email, whatever, telling me that you passed. So then that way I can be like, oh my gosh, you passed. And it's super fun. And I've been doing this for years and I love seeing that. So even if no one in your life will celebrate you and you're like, listen, I don't have people that really care that I passed the edTPA, you let me know and I will send you big congrats. So I hope this helped. I hope it made sense. I hope you have more faith in your portfolio. Again, take it slow. And please let me know if you have any questions or thoughts. I'll have more links and resources and things in the description box. And enjoy the rest of your day, evening, night. Hang in there. You've got this, and you're going to do really, really amazing things.